Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer, welcome to my channel, and today I wanted to talk through the Women's Prize shortlist for 2022. I just finished reading my final book from the shortlist and just wanted to condense them all in one place and sort of make some predictions about who I think will win and who I would quite like to see win. But it's a really fun list. The Women's Prize is one that I've been only really following for a couple of years. I think I was aware of it for a bit longer than that, but sort of only really the last few years I've been following it and reading the entire shortlist. Although I think this shortlist initially got a bit of, I think the long list generally when it was announced, there was a little bit of sort of discussion of like, oh, this is not a particularly exciting one, or there seem to be some big names missing. And I think that often happens with any list, right? That people are like, well, my favourite's not here, or these big books I was expecting aren't here, and therefore this might make it a bad list. But actually, I think, like I found with last year's Booker long list, once I sort of dived in or dove in, or I still don't really know what the proper one is. I think dove is more American. When I sort of dived in and really enjoyed, read the whole lot, I enjoyed a great number of them and found it a really strong long list. So I think some of the things here with this Women's Prize shortlist, before, when the shortlist was announced, I'd only read 2 of them in advance. And so really exciting to have read the other 4 and kind of to go through it. Also, I should just say at the beginning, there won't really be any spoilers, I don't think, for these books. And I've done separate reviews of all 6. But this is more of a kind of condensed version with some sort of predictions and everything thrown. So there we go, let's get started. First up, going alphabetically through the authors, we have The Bread the Devil Knead by Lisa Allen-Agostini. I read this really recently. This is a story about a Trinidadian woman who is in an abusive relationship with a man who is quite famous. He's sort of a locally famous musician, and that kind of poses its own issues. And this book largely is her navigating not only her friendships and everything else outside of this relationship, but also trying to find ways that she can find happiness and hope and joy and everything outside of this relationship, and sort of occasionally trying to find ways of finding joy within it, although that often doesn't really go well, as you might expect. And I think this book is just such an interesting and sensitive book. It's a really difficult one to read in times because there are many passages of quite in-depth descriptions of abuse, both sort of physical and sexual, and both with her as an adult and as a child, and it's a lot. This book is a lot to sort of process and take in. But at the same time, this book really sort of navigates that idea of trauma and how to sort of come out the other side of some of these things. And there's a lot of joy for her also, to be found. Like we hear a lot about the things that she's incredibly good at around sort of fashion and style and things like that. And she's loved by so many of her friends. And she's just such an interesting character at the heart of it, Alethea. And it's so difficult to watch her go through this, but I think this book is a real powerhouse in how it approaches that. It's just so sensitively and so cleverly. And so I wouldn't really be surprised to see this book maybe take it. I mean, with all of the 6, I wouldn't really be surprised if any of them won. But I think The Bread the Devil Knead is something quite special, even if it didn't always 100% work for me. But I think overall as a book is really strong and good. Next up, alphabetically, we have The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. And I spoke about this recently, but this is a book that deals with the idea of the power of stories, and both for good and for bad. So the power of stories to help redeem people, the importance of stories during a pandemic, but also the kind of national story of the US and what that looks like. So that for so many people in the US, there are these sort of founding stories that are really important, but actually those stories are quite different from for example, from the stories that native indigenous people might use to talk about the nation. And so it's really interesting to kind of also see in this book how characters try to reform themselves and change and better themselves. But also there is a sort of a haunting kind of ghost figure in this book as well, who is, largely there to kind of you know, we sort of see almost what happens when some of these stories aren't resolved in the way that they need. This story also grapples with the pandemic, and it grapples with George Floyd and a few other big moments in world and US history. And it's so interesting to see how this book does it in a way that, you know, I was expecting some of those things to feel quite difficult to read, because it still feels so soon, particularly the pandemic. It's such a, it looms over us in such a big way. But actually, I think this book does something quite special with it. It also contains these sort of little reading lists at the back, which are kind of quite random and quite bizarre sets of books, but actually really quite entertaining. This idea of what it means to be a reader and how important it is to read. And, you know, even, for example, there's a character who regularly goes to this bookshop but is unable to during the pandemic, and there's this sort of reaching across the aisles to sort of go and support this person and look after them when they can't get access to stories which they need to kind of make it through. So I think a really interesting and beautiful book in many ways as well. Next up, alphabetically, we have Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. And this is a book that deals a lot with mental health and particularly mental illness in quite a powerful way. It deals with a woman, Martha, who is undiagnosed for most of the book, and the diagnosis comes as a sort of big moment in the book where we're sort of held off from fully knowing all the information. But it deals a lot with sort of generational trauma, things passed down the line. And all of this makes it sound incredibly bleak, but actually in that bleakness is something incredibly funny. This is a very funny book in many parts. There's a really sort of scathing, sarcastic humour that sort of lingers behind everything. Our central character Martha is told by many people that she's really funny, whilst at the same time everybody's a bit worried about her because she doesn't seem particularly well or particularly happy. And so this book really deals a lot with those difficulties around just living life and going through relationships and having family, you know, family meetups and all those sorts of things when you are really at your lowest or when you're really particularly struggling. It's a really dark book in many ways, but like I said, so funny and so clever in the way it approaches things. This book kind of takes quite a few big risks. Like I mentioned with the diagnosis, there's a lot of information that's left off. And as a result, we as the audience, I think, are forced to confront some of our own thoughts and some of our own prejudices about what might actually be happening there. That actually we might think it's a certain thing. Maybe we're wrong, actually. Maybe it doesn't have to be a certain way. So I think this is a really interesting book, and I would not be surprised if this takes it. I think it has a particular power. Even if the book itself has been quite divisive, with some people loving it and some people really not. But actually a divisive book is not the worst thing for a panel of judges, because often that might mean that there are a good few people really rallying behind it and pushing for it to win. Next up, alphabetically, we have Ruth Ozeki with The Book of Form and Emptiness. And this is a book that deals a lot with ideas around, again, with sort of diagnoses and things around that, but particularly sort of values and how various things around mental illness or mental health are judged by different cultures. So a core part of this book is around the idea of animism, or this kind of idea that all things, all people, all living creatures, but also, you know, items around the house have a soul, have a sort of spirit to them. And this sort of riffs off the idea of someone like Maria Kondo, and the idea that, you know, we should thank objects for being in our lives. And so actually as a result, that sets up a character like the sort of the mother in this book, who is we sort of see has sort of hoarding tendencies, and there is a sort of complication between her ability to see some of those objects as sort of being valid or being useful or having a life or a purpose, and her son, who is diagnosed quite early as being a sort of problem child by the sort of the state or by the kind of education service. And actually he hears objects, he hears them speak, he's able to have some kind of dialogue with them. And that kind of sets up this really interesting discussion around what it really means when we talk about illness or when we talk about things being unusual, because actually in some cultures those things would be entirely usual, or wouldn't be sort of pathologized, but might have a sort of another sort of more spiritual basis to them. And so this book sort of sets this up, and there's quite an interesting sort of set of contrasts around new versus old, versus you know, east versus west, and many other contrasts set up. And I think this is quite an interesting book. I did think it was a teeny bit too long for me personally. I know some people loved that this book is quite long and sort of really got lost in the story and in the pages. I think for me, tiny bit, you know, at time, I think I had quite a mixed sort of thing with this book. Around halfway through, I was like, I'm not sure if I can do this anymore. And it was an audiobook, but I kind of persevered and then really enjoyed what was happening later on in the book. So I think it is one that maybe needs a bit of a sort of careful, considered read and sort of being really in the story, but an interesting one nonetheless. And like with many authors on this list, I realised that I have not read anything else by them and should probably address that, because I've not read any other Ruth Ozeki books, and I know that I would love some of her other writing based on this, which many people have said is not necessarily her best, but is still a good book. Next up, we have Elif Shafak's The Island of Missing Trees, which is a rich and quite varied story that kind of looks at various divisions, essentially. It kind of sets up quite a few divisions. It talks a lot, for example, about various divisions within the world, within relationships, and all those sorts of things. So we have a father and a daughter, and the kind of the gap that's between the two of them, particularly as they have moved to London, and the sort of the family history is in Cyprus. Cyprus, a nation that, or an island that has been quite divided into North and South, or North Cyprus and Republic of Cyprus. Both of whom have their own kind of traditions that are related as well and sort of linked to other countries. So Northern Cyprus having more of a sort of Turkish connection, the Republic of Cyprus having more of a Greek connection, and the sort of complications around that. And in the midst of this, we have a sort of an old family story that's told, which is a story of kind of lovers who are kind of almost like Romeo and Juliet style, kind of, you know, split by the nation and sort of by families and all these sorts of things. And so it's a really rich and sumptuous and generous and warm story, and really loving. It also features a talking fig tree. It's quite balmy in a few quite wonderful ways. It's very folkloric. It has that really sort of gentle feel of somebody sitting you down and telling you a story as you're sort of, you know, like a child sitting cross-legged listening to your grandmother tell a story. That kind of warm, loving feel to this book. So I really enjoyed this, as much as, you know, parts of it maybe a tiny bit formulaic for my taste, but like the writing is so warm and lovely that I kind of didn't care. I was just here to listen to more of Elif Shafak's beautiful writing style, which is so poetic and loving and calming and soothing. And so I just really enjoyed what this book did. And last but not least, Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. It was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year. And this is a sort of epic story, I guess, over sort of 600 pages of going through the lives of two different women, one in the sort of current times and one sort of about 100 or so, no, maybe less than that, years before, who and we sort of see the parallels in their two lives. So one of them is a film star who is playing well, he's always been inspired by and is hoping to play the character of play this other woman in a film, this other woman being a pilot who was sort of a very early one of the first women pilots, and particularly has this sort of appeal as being, you know, kind of like Amelia Earhart or anybody else, this sort of icon status, but is also a bit maybe less known than Amelia Earhart. And the interesting thing about this woman is just that we see her inner life through both diaries and through various things and through relationships. And there are so many little parallels that go between these two women's lives. If we see how, for example, the woman in the past facing sexual harassment is mirrored in current day you know, living, where that hasn't necessarily been solved, you know, that still exists. These women still face quite similar things, unfortunately, to advance in their careers, or you know, the sort of threat of violence or of their stories being leaked to the press and that destroying their reputation. These things don't fade. These are the same year on year. And there's something quite sort of ultimately depressing about that in the story, that these things haven't changed. But also this is a story full of hope and love, where there's this kind of connection between these two women almost talking to each other across years. And there's something so powerful and beautiful about the way it handles that. I just found this book really lovely and really entertaining all the way throughout. I just sort of got lost in the world of this book. So I think it's really great. it's just nice. But of these six, these are the six shortlisted books. And in terms of who I think will win, this one feels like quite an open one. I can't necessarily pin it down too much. My sort of hunch, I guess, is that this might go to either Sorrow and Bliss, I think, or The Sentence, which is magically dropped down here while I was talking, or The Sentence. I think these two books both have a really current feel to them in terms of talking about something quite present. So Louise Erdrich's book could only really be written now. There's something very sort of early 2020s about this book, just not only in terms of the historical aspects of it, but also just the themes and where it kind of goes. I think Meg Mason's book is just incredibly funny and clever and powerful in so many ways, so I think that has a really strong chance as well. But I also wouldn't be that surprised if The Bread the Devil Knead by Lisa Allen-Agostini were to make it and win, just because I think it's also such a fascinating interior examination of this woman's life, and the sort of the various complications and things going on around her. That said, I'm almost definitely going to be wrong. It'll be one of the others. But those are sort of, in some ways, my predictions, in some ways, my personal choices. I'd really love to see Sorrow and Bliss take it. I think The Bread the Devil Knead would be a really great winner. And as much as, you know, I could sort of quibble at some parts of it, I think The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak is beautiful. Great Circle was one of my, you know, it was a 5-star read for me as well, so I'd quite like to see that up there. Basically, I like them all. But I think my personal favourites, I think, probably would be Great Circle, and Sorrow and Bliss, with maybe The Bread the Devil Knead a sort of close runner-up to that. Anyway, I've been wrong almost every single time with this prize, so who knows? Let's see. But I think either way, these are 6 great books to check out, and I really do urge you to sort of kind of engage with them and see what works for you. I understand not all of them are going to work for everybody. That's kind of how shortlists normally work anyway. And also, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Pop them in the chat below, and the comments below, if you've got any sort of thoughts on who you'd really like to see win, if you've got any personal favourites, all of that kind of stuff. I've been Bob, talking about the Women's Prize. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.